Members of the House. Yeah, we are seeing this resolution come before us today because this resolution is one of the most nationally consequential items that we deal with every year. I've been dealing with this now for, I believe this is my 7th year, because I do think it's that important, and it's important to the people of our state as well. It's my love for my country and my love for my neighbors that makes me want to put in the time both to research all of the history behind this Article 5 power that we have, and also the proposition of getting together with the other states to reform the federal government. Every year we see this come back because the grassroots movement is growing year by year. And yes, this particular one has had only 15 states pass it in a very short period of time, but over the history of our country, there have been over 400 applications by states to have an Article 5 convention. In my remarks, I'm going to quote a few different authors here that I think help summarize some of the answers to the objections that we heard from the previous speaker. The biggest obstacle to a successful term limits convention will be policymakers and concerned citizens who believe that such a convention has the power to, quote, run away and open up the entire Constitution for revision. Under these wild scenarios, the Bill of Rights gets repealed and a tyranny is foisted upon the American people. Now, these fears have been seeded into many Americans' minds by groups like the John Birch Society and Eagle Forum. At first, it's important to note that those who subscribe to runaway convention thinking, they're not less patriotic or doing so with wicked aims. Most of them do support the ideas that have been floated inside the Article 5 sphere, mainly restricting the power of the federal government. And our disagreement is simply on how to get there. After consulting with the top experts, we've concluded that the arguments for a runaway convention are without merit and not supported by the evidence. There's historical precedent. Exhibit A in this discussion is America's very long and documented history of conventions. In the hundreds of state and interstate conventions that have taken place here in the founding era and beyond, none have ever run away. On rare occasions, a delegate would suggest departing from the agenda, but that person would get nowhere because checks and balances were built in, as they are here. A common meme on the internet is calling the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 a runaway based on poor scholarship. The narrative goes like this. Convention delegates only had the authority to amend the Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution, but they ignored that and threw the articles on the scrap heap. Hence, it said they jumped over their boundaries and ran outside the law. In reality, though, 10 of the 12 state delegations at that convention had broad authority, which included the ability to adopt a new constitution, and this was made explicit by the instructions their states gave them. Now, Congress did recommend that the convention stay within a very limited scope, but it was merely advice because they weren't calling an Article 5 convention. They were calling it on their own authority. And I want to bring your attention to what I think is a very important use of Article 5 that was sort of alluded to by the previous speaker, who was worried that somehow, using this mechanism, we would lose the Bill of Rights. We would lose the Second Amendment. We'd lose the First Amendment. I want to tell you a story. On November 20, 1788, the state of Virginia formally submitted the very first application for the Convention of States under Article 5 of the United States Constitution, just a year after the Constitution was actually adopted. During the Convention of 1787 and the ensuing years at the ratification debates, there was strong argument made for including a Bill of Rights within the Constitution. During the convention, the delegates were mostly set against the inclusion of a Bill of Rights in the new Constitution, defeating efforts by George Mason to consider one. James Madison eventually became one who would promise that once the new government was set up, the Congress themselves would introduce amendments under its own Article 5 amendment proposing power. Now, today when elected officials make a promise, our first inclination is to laugh. But Madison, like the majority of the framers, was a man of integrity, and he'd make good on his promise. He was elected to the House of Representatives in that very first Congress, and he actually attempted to introduce the Bill of Rights almost immediately. But guess what? He was thwarted in his first 2 attempts. Now, eventually he succeeded in getting his concept for 12 amendments at least introduced. But at the same time, Virginia was not a state to sit back and wait. So on November 20th, 1788, Virginia was the very first state to exercise its new power to apply to Congress under the second Article 5 mode of proposing amendments. They applied to Congress for a convention of states to get the Bill of Rights passed. George Mason, now a state legislator, realized that he needed to use this mechanism to hold Congress's feet to the fire and make them make good on their promise. So after this, finally the first Congress went to work to take up Madison's amended proposals and ended up passing them out of Congress with the required 2/3 vote and sent them out to the states for ratification in 1789. It's very instructive to note the language used by the state of Virginia in this very first Article 5 application. Today, many who oppose a convention of states disparagingly refer to the phrase convention of states as a modern invention in order to avoid using constitutional convention. But scholarship matters here, especially when dealing with these matters of grave historic importance and national consequences. Below is an excerpt from the very first application for a convention of states under Article 5. The anxiety with which our countrymen press for the accomplishment of this important end will admit of delay. The slow forms of congressional discussion and recommendation, if indeed they should ever agree to any change, would, we fear, be less certain of success. Happily for their wishes, the Constitution hath presented an alternative by admitting the submission to a convention of the states. That was from the first Article 5 application, when they named the Convention of the States, which is a meeting of states outlined underneath the Constitution. It's not an extra constitutional meeting that we're calling for. And interestingly, there have been over 400 applications for a convention of states under Article 5, but none of the states have ever achieved the 2/3 requirement. That's because the Congress understands that there has to be the same number of applications on the same topic. And that brings us to the historic effort by the Convention of States today. Never before in Americans' history has there been a coordinated effort nationwide to legislatively choreograph identical resolutions for state applications under Article 5. And today the 2/3 requirement equals 34 states, and we've passed in 15 states so far. The road ahead is difficult, but we and thousands of volunteers and supporters nationwide are up to the challenge. We find ourselves in a war of information over those that would put historical fallacies about the Philadelphia Convention being a runaway convention. So from history, we can see that the author of Article 5 itself, who attended the Constitutional Convention but did not sign it because it did not have the Bill of Rights, was able to use Article 5, the process we're talking about today, as a mechanism to obtain the very Bill of Rights, the 10 amendments that we enjoy today. This power we're talking about is given to state legislatures in Article 5. It's the only power given to state legislators in the United States Constitution. I think it's time we join together with the other states, exercise this power, and further the national conversation that it is the states who created the federal government, and it is the states who can reform the federal government. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I urge your passage of the resolution.
Go to conventionofstates.com, press the button, sign the petition. More importantly, get 10 of your friends to do the same. When you sign the petition, then that sends a letter to your state legislator. You go on the list in their district as a supporter. We deliver those lists to the state legislators. It means something to them.